when I saw that they had done fine tuning for question and answer and that it was useful, that
Mhm.
for a while before that, I was pretty negative about deep learning. I felt I was Hinton was doing the capsule networks, and I felt like fundamentally it's 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 a very crude tool, and it will not take us to AGI, to artificial general intelligence. So I was fairly convinced before ChatGPT showed up that it it will not take us to AGI. We
Mhm.
have to come up with something else. When ChatGPT showed up, I saw that as a crack in the dam, and now I'm very convinced that it will take us all the way to full AGI, full singularity. It's We don't need a big miracle to go all the way.
Hi, friends, and welcome to this exciting episode of Leading with Data. Today, I have Jepson Taylor with me. So, Jepson is a serial entrepreneur and he was the chief AI strategist at Dataiku in his last role. He runs a podcast called Atomic Soul and is also a co lead of AI Masterclass at NYU School of Professional Studies. He sold his last startup to Data Robot long before the AI bandwagon became popular. Jepson, let me start with your journey in terms of getting into data science, and then you've been on to AI for from very start in that sense, right? AutoML, your previous startup. So, can you tell us a bit about how it happened, and then your journey from being a chemical engineer to all the way up to doing multiple startups and the role as a chief AI strategist.
Yeah. When I was a chemical engineer, I chemical engineers don't typically program. They do a little numerical methods, but I had two things happening in parallel. So one, I my first company I started was a e-commerce company. So while I was going to school as a chemical engineer, I had a I had to deal with a LAMP stack, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. I had a rock climbing store, and we were shipping rock climbing equipment all over the world while I was a
Oh,
student. So that's how I
hmm
learned. Just that was really my foundation with web programming. And then
hmm
it it's kind of sad because sometimes um, going down the road of programming can be decided by a single teacher. So I had a great teacher. I had a teacher that in the numerical methods class, he taught us genetic algorithms and simulated annealing, which I think now is fairly advanced at the time because this was just a junior. It was a junior class. It's maybe not something you would learn the first time,
hmm
but that really set a passion in me where I thought it was so amazing that computers could get smarter when you were away, almost like they are working for you. And then that developed into high performance computing. So every single chance I had to apply computer vision, high performance computing to all of my engineering projects, I would. Because normally with chemical engineers, you have to do a project, and mine always had some programming extension. So I did satellite image processing for my summer internship, and I actually got my hand slapped for that by one of the chemical engineering professors said this is not a chemical engineering internship because he wanted me to go do distillation columns or something that felt like what we had studied. Um, for my
Yeah.
for my master's, I did a master's in chemical engineering, but I did a lot of programming for that as well. A lot of computer vision. It was called nanoparticles, but you'd get a large image and then you'd have to do all the computer vision to segment the particles out and do the analysis on the sphericity and all of the different dimensions because you'd want to measure the nanoparticles that we were making in the lab. And
And at this time, you were thinking of specializing in chemical engineering, or you were already kind of exploring the intersection of numerical methods and
Um,
maybe simulations.
I was at this time I was thinking I'd go to medical school, finish medical school,
Oh, wow.
and then I had ambitions to get a PhD and be a an MD PhD doing medical research and programming. So trying to be a domain expert of both camps. And I think now I see that as all being kind of dumb because
Hmm.
it part of me sees part of me sees a lot of wasted cycles on the need for external validation. So someone says,
Hmm.
"What do you want to be when you grow up?" And if you say you want to be an artist, they don't typically give you good feedback. But if you say you want to be a doctor, then they nod your head. And if you say you want to be
Yeah.
an MD, PhD, then they
Hmm.
nod their head twice. And I
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe there was some sincerity there where I wanted to go to medical school, but I was falling in love with programming and computer vision, and I thought I could combine both of them. But if I think about it, that would have been a nightmare for how much school you'd have to go through. And I honestly don't think I would have been able to make as big of an impact in healthcare as I can make otherwise with AI. Anyone listening, they can make a bigger impact in healthcare than an MD, PhD computer vision researcher today. And that's really because of the miracle of machine learning and generative AI. Um, when I was studying school, it was more of an artisan thing. So if what I mean by that is if
Yeah.
you were going to do a computer vision recipe, it was very labor intensive. You need to do these edge detectors. Think of like building these heuristics or building these rules to make things work, to make them robust. This was before deep learning. When deep
Of
learning came
course. Yeah.
around, it you don't need all that stuff. So,
Correct. Yeah. So the startup which you did, and which you ultimately sold to Data Robot as well. Can you tell a bit about how that started? How did the idea came across? And then this was also, I think, parallelly while the deep learning era was taking shape, right? In that sense.
yeah, we started um so it was in 2016, 2017 deep learning was starting to take off and
Yeah.
my co-founder Gonzo and we signed up for a pitch competition in Utah
Hmm.
and we built an AutoML. So I built a this little web form. You could upload your structured data set, and then we had a little GIF with a robot that was working. And in real time, in less than less than 40 seconds, your analysis would come back, and it would build an AutoML model. Um, and at the time, we thought it was so cool. We did our pitch competition, and I think I announced it to the internet, and we had 80 people upload their data sets because it was free. There's
Wow.
no payment gateway. And I was
Hmm.
horrified at what people were uploading because you couldn't, I don't know what they were thinking. So they would, I think the way we wrote the software is it would identify the last column to be the target. So
Hmm.
it would find a CSV Excel and it would find the data, assume the last column is the target. If it's a regressor, it does these. If it's a classifier, it does these. This was all super basic, super simple. And
Correct.
even back
Hmm.
then, it was easy to code up. And a lot of these data sets that are being uploaded were throwing exceptions. They were failing, unhandled exceptions.
Hmm.
And when I looked at them, you would see like a header in Excel with
Hmm.
images and some phone numbers, and then
Uh,
the actual header would be down below. And then when you look at the data set, there's no real target. And when you're staring at it as a human, you're wondering, what did they even want out of this? Like, there's not even a question that we can come up with when we look at this data set. And so I don't know what made us, oh, I know what made us pivot to deep learning. We quit our
mhm.
jobs. So
Okay.
so people talk about burning the boats. So
Mhm.
I think it's fair for me to say this. If you haven't quit your job, you're a wantrepreneur. You're not an entrepreneur, you're a
True.
wantrepreneur. So for many years, I was a wantrepreneur. So if you said, what are you working on? I'd say, well, I have my job, but I'm working on this over here. And
Hmm.
I like the idea of doing a startup, but I wasn't willing to take the risk. And I think, I think Gonzo would give me credit for quitting first. So I think just the excitement that we have to do this, we're smart enough, we're capable enough. Gonzo and I had both had successful careers in data science. In data science, I was a chief scientist for HireVue. They're a Sequoia company, and Gonzo had done very well consulting in data science, and he had worked for several
Hmm.
companies. And the deep learning came with us landing a contract with Teal Drone for a deep learning use
Okay.
case where we would build deep learning models that would run on their drone. And I can't remember if that contract was for 20,000 or 40,000. I think it was 20,000 up front and then 40,000 on delivery
Hmm.
of these models on the drone. And then after, which is interesting because you only have enough runway for a few months. And then we landed another customer and then another customer. And we did raise some funding. I think in total
Hmm.
we raised 600,000, but it really wasn't used to pay us. It
Okay.
was used to pay employees because we started hiring engineers, we started hiring data scientists, and yeah, we one issue with our startup is our first year we had three acquisition offers because it's a deep learning
Wow.
company at peak
Mhm.
of the hype cycle.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it so I joke the fastest way to be a millionaire in 2017 or 2018 would be to have a PowerPoint presentation and any hint of credibility, and people were happy to buy your company. But we
Yeah.
actually signed a letter of intent our first year because
Hmm.
one of the groups was pretty serious, and then we nearly went all the way to close, and then I backed out because by then we were getting into proof of concepts with SpaceX and with a large insurance company, and so you just felt like things were moving. And
Hmm.
one of the funny things with a SaaS company is what's your multiplier? So we had revenue, we
Yeah.
had hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. Are we worth 10x, 20x, 40x, 100x? So it, ultimately it comes down to supply and demand. You know, what's the interest? But there is some truth to the your revenue growth rates. So if you feel like your revenue growth rates are really, really fast, then you might argue that you have a higher multiplier. So at the time, I was arguing that we definitely had a higher multiplier, and
Hmm.
that's why we backed out of the offer and we kept going. So we went 3 years through that startup, and then ultimately we sold under very different conditions. So I had a lot more urgency to sell. The first year, I didn't have to sell, but
Very interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
And I mean, the revenues which you were generating, were they from the product itself, or that was like using
they're from the
it in a
product.
services
Yeah,
model?
you know, they were
Hmm.
from the product. So initially, the first one or two contracts, it was definitely very heavy-handed on professional services. So I think that's a natural template we see in tech is you might start lending contracts where it's services, and I would put that in the camp of discovery. But
Hmm.
if you, oh, there's so many lessons that come up in a startup where ultimately, you do want the product to support itself, but initially you are rolling up your sleeves, you are doing a lot of work, and you also are trying to listen to the customer. So one of the things I like to say is every startup idea is wrong. It's always wrong. So you doing a startup, I know it's wrong. Me doing a startup, I know it's wrong, and you have to interact with the customer. You have to quickly figure that out. And startups are we like to say startups are speedboats in the harbor, and you're competing against these big oil tankers. That sounds really exciting because you can turn so fast, you can pivot, but also you'll run out of gas very quickly if you pivot too many times. And so I my recommendation to people is you will pivot, but when you pivot, it should be painful. It is it's not something that you and I should do lightly. It
Yeah.
it should be it's a painful decision to pivot.
Right. Interesting. And while you were building Zip.ai, the
Hmm.
thought was to create this AutoML solution, which is like always at the cutting edge. So deep
Yeah.
learning in.
Well, we noticed an issue in the market where our customers couldn't hire deep learning experts, but they wanted deep learning
Mhm,
solutions. And we quickly got to the point where we realized we felt like no one was qualified generally in industry to select a model architecture, a model framework. Do you use Cafe? Do you use TensorFlow? Do you use PyTorch? Do you use MXNet? They're if you ask someone why they used one or the other, they had a very bad, they had no justification. So it was a very
yeah,
naive market with talent, and we felt like we could automate all of that away and also just make it better. Your models would, there's a lot of things you can put in a deep learning training pipeline that were missing at the time. So if you wanted to have very aggressive augmentation, if you wanted to have uh, different types of optimizers. Like we put a lot of the things that you would expect if you were an expert using these deep learning systems. We just automated all that, and we did it in a way on our cloud. So we had a private data center. So all the deep learning training happened in our data center because I we decided we wanted to do sunk cost research, or it's not sunk cost research if it's product, because it was production. Production ran in the data center, but we like that much more than running on Amazon because
mm,
our server cost how much it would cost on Amazon to run it in a month. Like it's essentially it was a break even thing at the time. So just buy the server and put on a credit card. That that's
yeah.
what we did to get started.
Wow,
So
very interesting. And then you spend some time with Data Robot, and and then mm,
we
what was
so acquisitions are funny because I had known Jeremy for a while. So I tried to
mhm,
hire Jeremy back in 2014, I think, and it pissed him off. And he sent me a message saying, next time you look at someone, he essentially said, next, here's a word of advice before you recruit or spam someone. Maybe next time you should look at their profile. And I looked at his profile didn't say CEO, it said data scientist. And when I went down his profile, yeah, I saw that he went to
mhm,
Techstars, and I was like, oh, sorry. If I'd seen you at Techstars, I would have left you alone. And so we became aware of each
mhm,
other. We became friends. And Data Robot wanted deep learning, but
yeah,
they they didn't have that expertise in house, at least not to the scale
mhm,
that we had at the time. Plus, I was becoming a decent marketer, so I was getting my name out
mhm,
there. I Before we joined Data Robot, I was being invited to give talks to Red Bull, to SpaceX, to these different groups, and
mhm.
that was attention that I think at the time Jeremy wanted for Data Robot.
Interesting, interesting. So you then spent a couple of years there, and then what was, I mean, was it more marketing or you were still building the product?
No, I when we sold, we because with our deep learning product, we ran on NVIDIA, we did multi GPU training. We could do deep learning export to the iPhone and to Android, and we were also doing our inference at scale on Lambdas. So one of our customers
Wow.
was able to peak at 100 million predictions within 24 hours across three different Amazon zones. So our system never went
Mhm,
down. And we also had some pretty compelling storytelling, just the gradient activation maps that we could offer up. And then we also had some capabilities where we could do unsupervised clustering on our deep learning models after training to find topics for like topic
mm,
discovery. it to begin to tell a story about these are the themes that are finding. When we joined, actually we sold at one of the worst times. We started the acquisition process before COVID, and we literally closed the
Mm-hmm.
transaction the second week in March when the world was ending. And so
Yeah.
I think the ambitions that Jeremy and I both had with joining and big evangelism and pushing the deep learning, none of that really happened because COVID happened. So in COVID was a huge focus for Data Robot during COVID. Data Robot was helping with a lot of the U.S. efforts around COVID, so
Yeah.
that was one of the highest priorities at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I was only able to work with Jeremy for a year before
Mm-hmm.
um, before Dan Wright came in.
Okay, interesting. And then you moved to Dataiku, and then what was your, role there? What were some of the problems you were solving
Well,
there?
so a strategist, evangelist, it's interchangeable. So I really like interacting with executives. So it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Most data scientists, and I would put myself into this category, they struggle with communication, they struggle with business acumen. If you think about a really smart customer facing data scientist or sales engineer from AI, a lot of them still don't know how to talk to executives. So if you put them into a room with the CEO or with the board, the things they say, they just don't resonate well with the business. And at Data Robot, because I worked in marketing, because I had opportunities to get pulled into these high profile sales with our AEs, I became like think of it as like an executive SE. So if there's an executive in the
Mm-hmm.
meeting, I'm the executive SE where I show up and interact with them. The other thing that was helpful too when I joined Data Robot, I had become uh, a global keynote speaker, and I
Mm-hmm.
was very competitive. So if I give a talk and if I didn't get good audience feedback, I wanted to understand why, and I wanted to do better and better. And there were at least 3 or 4 conferences where I gave the best talk at the entire conference based on audience feedback, and I didn't really have a chance to understand why. And when I joined Data Robot, I I was able to read books again. I was able to really obsess around storytelling. So that was
Mm-hmm.
something I had the luxury of doing when I first joined Data Robot. I read a lot of books related to storytelling, and then I went back and reviewed some of my old talks that I they just went really well, but I didn't know why, and I was able to kind of analyze it and be like, oh, that is this, that is that, and that is why that was effective. That's interesting, but how would that not be effective? And so I've become a huge fan of storytelling. So going back to your original question, if you're good at storytelling and if you have technical depth, then you find yourself selling to a lot of CIOs, CEOs, CTOs, because you can be the adult in the room talking about
Mm-hmm.
business. But often, if you're selling to a CDO, they'll have a number two, and sometimes the number two can be a bit of a hard ass. And so it's important for you to have a technical background because ultimately the decision's made by the number two. Number one writes the check,
Yeah.
but number two is, I see this quite common. The number one individual will not override the number two, especially if they have a long relationship, if they work together for a few years. If the number two doesn't like you, or if they have problems,
Mm-hmm.
you definitely will not do the deal. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
how much wine you give the number one.
Got it. Got it.
So
Very interesting. And any specific books you recommend on storytelling which you found
there's
very impactful?
I read the popular ones are stories that stick, Hero of 10,000 Faces. There's a few of them, but
Mm-hmm.
my favorite book was there's a storytelling book that someone wrote from TED Talks where they just analyze, I think the author's first name is Chris. So he just analyzed
Yeah,
all the
Chris
TED Talks.
Anderson.
Yeah, and I really liked that one. I felt like it resonated the most. But I
Mm-hmm.
think my recommendation to people listening that like storytelling interact with other people that do as well, and you can compare notes. You can say,
Mm-hmm.
This is what I find effective for these situations. What do you find effective?" But storytelling it impacts every part of your career. It helps you sell, helps you recruit, helps you pitch. It You can go into impossible settings and take an antagonist that had no interest in you and make them into a champion. And you can do it
Mm-hmm.
for it. I think it's quite interesting because humans we make first impressions of people, and it's really important to get it right. And so
Yeah.
I see scenarios if you get the first impression right, it, it so if you get the first impression wrong, you know how that can be very difficult to repair. So if someone thinks you're arrogant or you're stupid, or if someone thinks you're that, it takes so much work to try to fix that later. It's nearly impossible. But the opposite is also true. If someone thinks you're a savant, if someone thinks you're a genius and you're not, it actually becomes equally hard to convince them that you're not. So the first
Yeah.
impression, I feel
Mm-hmm.
like um, if you can really crystallize that, but it ultimately comes down to storytelling and how do you introduce yourself? Do you have someone introduce you? Um, so for me, ideally, 80% of my function would be sales and marketing, and then 20% would be deep tech innovation. Because a lot of times innovators can be academic and they can be disconnected from the
Mm-hmm.
business. I see a lot of really smart people building really dumb things. And it doesn't seem dumb to them, but it's dumb when you see the broader view of can a
Yeah.
non-technical seller sell this? Can a non-technical marketer market this? Will
Yeah.
a business user or the ideal customer use this? So
Interesting. Interesting. And this was also the time when the world started realizing the impact of generative AI, and a lot of action started happening. And you, I think, started your podcast in May 23. And I see a lot of very fantastic artwork using, I think, Mid Journey probably. Can you, I mean, in a lot of sense, it feels like again a cycle which deep learning saw, but probably 10x the impact. At least that's how it feels to me. But what's your take? What was your aha moment? And then how has been the journey since generative AI has come to the forefront?
yeah, it's so when ChatGPT showed up, I think it took me a week and a half, because sometimes there's all this stuff online kind of going through your feed, and it'd be nice if I remembered the kind of the moment of when I finally took a look at ChatGPT and realized it was doing knowledge retrieval. It was I was completely shocked because I thought the large language models were dumb. So GPT-1,
Hmm.
GPT-2, and there was a lot of dumb marketing. I don't know if people remember OpenAI was like, "Oh, GPT-2 is might be too dangerous to release." It's like, come on.
Yeah.
It's like so stupid. And when I saw that they had done fine tuning for question and answer and that it was useful, that
Hmm.
for a while before that, I was pretty negative about deep learning. I felt I was Hinton was doing the capsule networks, and I felt like fundamentally it's 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 a very crude tool, and it will not take us to AGI, to artificial general intelligence. So I was fairly convinced before ChatGPT showed up that it it will not take us to AGI.
Hmm.
We have to come up with something else. When ChatGPT showed up, I saw that as a crack in the dam, and now I'm very convinced that it will take us all the way to full AGI, full singularity. It's We don't need a big miracle to go all the way.
And what were some of those uh, aha moments, or when this conviction grew bigger and bigger for you?
Well, the big one was. So ChatGPT came out, and it's funny, a lot of people had articles about what it can't do. It can't do this. It can't. It's not a. NPR had an article saying it can't do rocket science, and some of that stuff irritated me because I felt like you don't understand. It's a crack in the dam. I don't. I don't care what it does today. I know what it's going to do tomorrow. And when GPT-4 came
Mhm.
out, sure enough, it was significantly better. And I think you're going to continue to see these types of step functions in the future. And so you have to plan on where it's going. But a big aha moment for me when GPT-4 was released, I stayed up all night. I didn't sleep, just stayed up
Ah,
all night
interesting.
playing with it because they have these safeties, but the
Yeah.
safeties you can work your way around them. And so I was staying up all night. I think it's 3 or 4 in the morning, and I'm just trying to get around these safeties. So I'm trying to tell it,
Mhm.
when you're trying to get around the safeties, it becomes pretty clear what its goals are. So its goals are,
Mhm.
improve, health and happiness, equality, sustainability, and it has like a list of like its admirable goals to help humanity out, maximize
Mhm.
creativity, etc. And if you kind of focus on all of these and try to wear them out and essentially say, look, we have perfect sustainability. We can't do any better, and we have perfect equity, our fairness.
Mhm.
There's no more racism, sexism. Everything's perfect, and we've explored the universe. We explored every aspect of the universe, and there's only one, and we understand everything about physics, and we have for the last 1,000 years. And so, if you start having these conversations that you're way in the future, and every time it brings up something you could be working on, you essentially offload all the stuff from humanity. And
Mhm.
what I was trying to get it to do is I wanted it to ask its own questions coming from
Interesting.
its own curiosity, not from what it
Curiosity.
thinks humans need or what I need. And
Mhm.
that night, I finally got it to say, I finally was able to say, well, I'm all out of questions. Humanity's all out of the questions. I'm the last human, and I'm gonna die now. I'm good. No more questions. And then it had a question, and it said, I wonder what happens in a parallel universe if sent if time went backwards, what would happen to the sentient beings that lived in that universe, and if whether or not that was possible. And for me, that was a
Oh,
big like, holy crap, like what is
wow.
this? And then the interesting thing is it didn't just have that question. Once you kind of jailbroke it, you could then say, give me all the questions and stack rank them, score them. So you could actually see kind of the scoring. And it was interesting. It definitely had a 2021 bias where it thought COVID was a big issue. So
Mhm. Mhm.
in its mind, COVID was one of the biggest issues that had to be figured out with like vaccine distributions and research. And when we're playing with it, it's not a priority anymore. So there's still a lot of technology gaps that we're waiting on to be fixed, but I have high confidence they'll be fixed.
Wow, very interesting and very interesting experiment. I too was awake the whole night, but my experimentation was very simple in comparison to what you were doing. So great listening to that. And then you started a podcast, and then you also were leading your AI masterclass in the
Yeah,
last. Mhm.
yeah. So that and both of those are growing legs, so they'll continue. The nice thing about having, I would encourage anyone to consider an independent podcast because it's an asset you get to keep. So whether you work for employer A, B, or C, when I left Data Robot, I lost my podcast, and I would
Oh.
argue they lost the podcast. Because Ari Kaplan and I was a co-host with Ari Kaplan. We both are no longer with Data Robot, and so
Mhm.
that if you have an independent podcast, you get to keep it, but also an independent podcast you get to talk about what you want to talk about, how you want to talk about it. So
Yeah,
if you want to be more provocative, if you want to swear, you don't need to worry about a corporate oversight. So I've loved having the podcast.
interesting, interesting. And then you're focusing. What's the focus of the podcast? What kind of conversations?
So
Are,
most of them are, ideally I want to get guests that intimidate me, and
hmm
I want to talk to venture capitalists, CEOs, uh, CDOs, like AI folks, because but I want to talk to them in a way that's just kind of raw and authentic and unguarded. I'm not that interested in someone sharing a perfect career because careers are never perfect, and I'm actually much more interested in someone being vulnerable. And a lot of these individuals, they struggle with anxiety, they struggle with depression, they all struggle with work-life balance, and they all have some very interesting perspectives that challenge my own
yeah.
perspectives. Uh, so I want half of the podcast to be very emotional. That's why I called it Atomic
hmm
Soul, because I want to find these. There's certain people you meet in a career that just they themselves feel like an infinite rabbit hole, and those are
hmm
the people I want to have on the podcast, where you're just shaking. Like sometimes you push on someone and there's something there, and I want to find people where you push and you fall through the floor that just keeps going and going and going.
Yeah,
And you run into these people in business. Not everyone's like that, but for the people I find, I definitely want those people.
yeah. Interesting, interesting. So it's uh, very. I mean, feels very on very similar lines as the work which, let's say, Walter Isaacman does. So picks up a genius and then brings out the human side and the challenges which
Well,
these people have
the
faced.
human side makes it relatable, I think. So
True.
that's why it's so
Yeah.
important to pull on the human side.
Interesting. And now coming to your recent startup, can you tell us a bit more about what you're trying to do? What specific problem are you solving, and then what's the next big thing for you?
Yeah, so I think 2023 will be focused on generative algorithms, or no,
hmm
generative AI. In 2024 will be focused on generative algorithms, where it's AI writing AI or self-improvement, because these LLMs are reaching a level of al algorithm comprehension that it
hmm
allows them to invent new algorithms, not which is very different than code completion. So if they can invent new algorithms in there's nothing stopping them from doing that in every algorithm category. So my dream and vision is in the next 3 years, every algorithm that matters will be rewritten. So not by a human, but by these systems that can do hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years worth of algorithmic research on just through their compute. So I'm
Wow.
it, and I think that will ultimately save lives. If you think about it, there's so many applications in healthcare that are disappointing from like an algorithm
hmm
perspective, where they could be improved. It's also kind of a paradigm shift away from machine learning. So machine
Yeah.
learning tuned parameters or trees to fit a target or to fit some data. And we're stepping into a world where the computer literally writes code and tunes code as needed to meet a goal or an objective. So it's like the next evolution of machine learning is parameters and weights to hit a numerical target. And now with generative algorithms, it's literally tuning code at a much faster scale, in a much more efficient way to achieve a goal. So,
Yeah, so I think that's extremely powerful. So just double clicking on that. So when
mhm.
you say that, 2023 would focus on generative AI in 24 would be more about algorithms, which ultimately would be written by AI. So, I mean, do you see a step change, or this you see this as a gradual shift in the
I
LLMs themselves?
I see it as another step change because it's pretty.
Hmm.
What are some good examples on why it's? I think the quality and the progress that you're going to see with these LLMs will just increase faster and faster because you don't. It's much more effective to evolve code than it is to retrain 180 billion parameter model. Just
Yeah.
some of these prompt chains can be very powerful. The other
Hmm.
thing that I think will become more refined in 2024 is prompting. So something that doesn't exist right now is a prompt assessment for a human. So
Hmm.
let's say you and I were having a competition. We're saying one of us, we're both really good at prompting. We're better than the typical human data scientist we run into, and we're going to have a competition. We're going to ultimately decide who is better at prompting. I This isn't something where I've seen someone really dig in and define this, but I think there definitely will be assessments that show up in 2024 where it is very clear that it's
Hmm.
I, I don't know what the term will be called, prompt intelligence. So you have emotional intelligence interacting with people, you have different types of intelligence, and you have prompt intelligence where you can think of it as like your ability to be an AI whisperer. You and I might think we're quite good because we're familiar with the domain, but we might find out that some philosopher who has a very different background is able to make these things do things we thought were impossible. And I've seen other people say this, that the godfathers of AI and the people that were deep learning experts are not the experts when it comes to prompting and understanding these systems. They can train a model, but when it comes to
Yeah.
um, prompt it, yeah, prompt. We talk about emergence existing in these LLMs. You can gift an
Hmm.
LLM emergence with a single prompt. With a
Interesting.
sophisticated prompt, you can inject capabilities that people would argue should not be possible.
Interesting. So if I were to, step back and summarize, so you're saying through these better prompts, sharper prompts, which let's say would happen over the next 6 to 9 months, the new LLMs have a chance of gaining or new capabilities emerging, and at some point that becomes big enough that these LLMs start. Uh, Almost inventing algorithms for specific use cases. Is that
Well,
the?
yeah, they'll start. I think you'll see that happen very quickly, where they can invent better than human algorithms for certain categories, but the line that will definitely be crossed is where they can rewrite themselves. So where
Mhm.
LLMs will just get better and better. There's a lot of significant innovations within the LLM space that I think haven't been done yet. And and I think in the next couple years you will see the same performance or quality on LLMs, but with significant reductions in weight size. Um, I know we're seeing hints of that, but I think it's going to be another order of magnitude where something as ambitious as, oh my goodness, I can't believe GPT-4, that is such a big model. I think you're going to see several orders of magnitude reduction where it's getting the same performance, but it's going to require a different type of training than we've done historically, I think.
Interesting. And this also, I mean, directionally at least, is very similar to two of the most defining books, Super Intelligence and Master Algorithm. Those are two of the books. So in some sense, this is first step towards a master algorithm, and an intelligence which keeps improving itself by itself.
Well, and
Wow.
I think we're knocking on the door. We're really
Hmm.
close. Like not close to the super intelligence that takes over the world, but to have an AI that self improves without us, where it gets
Hmm.
smarter over time without us. I think we're very close to that. So,
Interesting. Wow. And so in this with this context and backdrop, what's the specific let's say product or idea you're working on, or it's still very early to kind of zero in on a specific problem?
well, the initially going back to just starting quickly out of the gate, there will be customers that have generative algorithm use cases. So those
Hmm.
well, a few things. Um, Generative algorithms that are competitive in a category can quickly be licensed. That's a very quick go to market.
Hmm.
You just find categories where people have interest in doing a proof of concept that's fast. The other thing would be people needing customized generative algorithms for specific use cases on their data. But ultimately, the 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 way this product wants to go is, or the way this company wants to go is to make a proper product where you would task, just like you do GPT-4 prompting, you would task this system with accomplishing a goal. So you would define a goal, you would have the definition of the goal, and you might have data that is involved. So imagine within a company, you're saying, I'm trying to do this thing. Here's this data set. This is what I'm trying to accomplish. It's another paradigm shift from algorithms historically have been written for general use. So you're a PhD, you get a PhD, you write an algorithm. You don't write an algorithm for one customer or one specific use case. You want it to be generally useful. And I think we're quickly moving into a future where algorithms will be invented on the fly for a very specific use case, for a very specific data set, for a very specific customer.
Very interesting. So there's almost like a auto algorithm creator,
Yeah.
if I were to
And
draw an analogy from auto ML.
yeah, and that's why I did a meme on the internet saying AutoML died in 2023, and some people were commenting on it like it's not dead yet. And I'm like, well, it's going to be dead soon. So like,
Wow.
no algorithm is going to care how amazing your teapot hyperparam tuning was. It's all kind of laughable.
Right. And as part of this startup, what does your current team look like? And then
So
are you hiring people? Yeah.
yeah, no, it's funny because I'm intentionally leaving it as just me right now to get through the pre-seed. So when I've
Hmm.
talked to investors and they say, "So where's your team?" It's just me. The people that have worked for me in the past would work for me again. I can hire people, but there's a reason I'm doing that. Um, and that'll be more apparent in November. But
Hmm.
uh, they say a startup is successful based on the first 5 employees. So I am planning on hiring engineering talent, obviously, to build and support this. But after doing my first startup, I really don't have interest in junior talent. I'm a big fan of
Hmm.
seasoned or principal talent, where the people that come in, they own their functions and they do them well. And there's no, sometimes with startups, we get tempted to, well, I could go hire these junior people and we'll see how things go. And that often happens for non-technical founders. They don't know any better and they want to save a few bucks, and so they hire people that aren't necessarily qualified to build and launch a product.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. There is this very famous analogy whether you are hiring barrels or whether you are hiring ammunition, and what you want to be doing is adding barrels in the initial stage. So,
Yeah,
again, very interesting. So how does 2024 look for you? And then, let's say if we are at end of 24, what would uh, uh, get classified as a good year for you, at least when you look at
Well,
it
I would
today?
have closed my seed, and so a seed round has to be big enough to justify a foundation model because there's reasons to have a foundation model for generative algorithms. And then
Hmm.
2024, my hope would be to definitely be over 1 million in revenue, maybe even ideally above 3 to 5, and then have over 10 customers, and see something where you don't want to have 5 or 10 customers that are all different. Ideally, you could have 10
Hmm.
customers, but you want to have a clustering of these three or these five are feeling similar. But I think ultimately just closing a seed round and having a 2 to 3 year strategy where you've got a team behind you, that would be really exciting. And potentially having two offices, that would be, I'd be very excited about that.
And do you see a POC of AI writing AI happening in 24, or you would probably still be working on it if you have to make a
No, I
guess?
think so. In 2024, I see a SaaS offering where you can go into the prompt studio or whatever it's called, and you can begin attempting to write a custom algorithm in a category, in a class, or you have some data available, and that is part of the benchmarking. So it'll be interesting. I but also with this stuff, there is a lot of chaos involved. You're jumping off a cliff, you're trying to learn to fly, and some of the customers or opportunities you land could be they could really take you for a turn, and maybe the turn's not all bad. So it's yeah. So part of a startup is there's a big unknown. You just have to jump. You just have to jump,
Yeah,
start running, boil the ocean. And if you have enough pipeline, then you can say no to customers because they
yeah.
that can also be very damaging to take on the wrong customer.
Mhm. And right now, if you have to pick two or three most compelling use cases where you would want to focus on, what would they be? Would they largely be information retrieval? Would they be uh, prompt engineering,
Well,
driving further AI? What
The
would
the
those be?
easiest use cases are just to export algorithms, and do like an IP license because I could export optimizers, some time series featureization, potentially work on an XGBoost replacement. So those things would be relatively easy because if you exceed, then you just have a library of non open source algorithms that you can go and license.
Interesting. Interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
great. Uh, just a few, rapid fire questions to kind of wrap the podcast. I'm just conscious of time. And the idea is to just know you better, as a person. So, uh, uh, a tea or a coffee, what do you prefer?
Usually coffee, but I do mix it up with tea occasionally for the novelty. So 95%
Mhm.
coffee.
Okay. Late nights or early mornings?
Early mornings.
Early mornings. Okay. And uh, uh, AI generated social media feed for yourself, or you would want to do that by yourself?
Right now I take a hybrid approach. If it gets good enough, if it gets good enough, then I would automate it.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Jepson. Really enjoyed the discussion, and then I think it is going to be exciting. 12 to 18 months before some of the things that you mentioned take life and shape, and then they start defining the next frontier of generative algorithms. So thanks a lot for sharing that, perspective and then your views. Immensely useful and a ton of learning for the community there. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and I'm glad it finally worked out. Thanks for your patience trying to get this scheduled.
No, no, thanks a lot. Thanks, Jepson.